Buddhism is a comprehensive system that shows us how to transform our minds from a state of suffering and dissatisfaction to one of extraordinary joy, awareness, and contentment. Vast in scope and profound in its implications, Buddhism accommodates every kind of mental disposition, but retains a laser-like precision that shows us what is to be accepted and what is to be rejected. It was realized and embodied by a human being like us. 2,500 years ago, an Indian prince named Siddhartha from the Shakya clan decided to give up his kingdom to search for a way out of suffering. Because of his relentless determination to find ultimate freedom, he came to understand the nature of his mind and in turn the ultimate reality of all phenomena. He was then called Shakyamuni Buddha. In this show, we will learn about the historical Buddha's life story, the spread of his teachings, and about the stages of the path to enlightenment.
In the following presentations, you're about to hear a great deal about the life, the accomplishments, and the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha. Now, the Buddha worked very hard in order to attain enlightenment, and the impetus behind that hard work was his strong motivation to achieve ultimate freedom and to benefit all living beings as much as possible. And so, remembering that we've discussed in the past the importance of our own motivation and modeling after the historical Buddha himself, now, before receiving these teachings, set in your own mind a strong motivation to be able to traverse this spiritual path, to reach enlightenment as quickly as possible in order to benefit all living beings.
One format that the life of Buddha is often presented in the Mahayana tradition is the presentation of what are called the 12 deeds. The 12 deeds are said to be the same activities that all of the 1,000 Buddhas who will appear during this fortunate eon in this world system, they'll all engage in these same kinds of activities. They won't have exactly the same lives. They'll be born in different ways, but they'll have certain format of their life that will be similar. And so for that reason, sort of, you might think it's just something that happened in the past, but it's going to happen in the future. So if you know about it, maybe you can be prepared when Maitreya comes and others. In the Mahayana scriptures, it's said that the Buddha himself, the first deed is his leaving of Tushita, handing over the teachership of Tushita, the residency there, to Maitreya, who will be the next Buddha. And the second deed is entering into the womb. The Buddha entered into the womb of his future mother, and at that point she had this dream, very spectacular and pleasant dream of a six-tusked white elephant entering into her. And upon exiting the womb, upon his birth, the Buddha was able to stand up. This young boy was able to stand up immediately and walk 7 steps. The Buddha himself Siddhartha himself showed himself to be incredibly, adroit and expert in many different things. And the next deed is called sporting or enjoying with the harem or retinue of wives. Every kind of pleasure, every kind of sense pleasure, food and warmth and various castles were built within the walls of the temple, of the city, of the royal city for Gautama. And it's during this point that he is now manifests kind of like what we might notice in the world when people get a little bit bored. He wants to go out of the temple, and his first journey out, he did see some individuals, and on successive journeys, he saw at various times old people, sick people, and a dead person. And and each time he would ask his attendant, what is this? I'd never seen this before. What is this old person bent over and so forth, with a cane? What's wrong with him? And his attendant would say, this is an old person. This happened. And Siddhartha would say, well, is that unusual? Are there many of them? And he would say, this happens to everyone. Everyone, this is the fate of everyone. He saw someone who looked like a renunciate, someone who is seeking the meaning of life, seeking to transcend birth, death, and aging, aging, death, sickness, and so forth, the things that the Buddha had perceived. So this supposedly was the element now that began to coalesce, that clicked in the Siddhartha's mind. This is what I should do. I should leave home also. And he takes the act, he takes his hair, his beautiful royal locks, and with his sword cuts them off. And it's said that that's one of the relics. He goes off seeking teachers, seeking the answer to sickness and old age and death. And even though the teachers themselves were very fond of Siddhartha, recognized him as a prince and saw his great qualities and the fact that he achieved their state, even though they were the teacher, he'd achieved the same realization they did in a very short amount of time. They asked him to stay on and teach their disciples. He refused and went off to try to find an answer to this riddle that he had encountered. Sometimes living on just a small berry from the tree a day. Siddhartha became very emaciated. So at this point, the Buddha himself is beginning to recognize that he's not making any progress. The Buddha went to bathe in the river, found himself very weak, couldn't even get out of the water. Began to worry, what's going to happen. He began then to beg some food. Now the Buddha is invigorated, Siddhartha is invigorated, and he seeks now a place to do meditation, then sits down on this cushion of grass with the determination, until I achieve the essence of enlightenment, I am not rising. So this is now the demarcation of the next act, which is called the defeat of Mara, or the defeat of the Maras. Mara is someone who it can be part of our own being, our own mind, or it can be something external that hinders our spiritual development. And that evening, he achieves his enlightenment, which is now called the next deed, under the Bodhi tree that evening, completely transformed, eliminating from his mind all the vestiges of ignorance and any kind of insufficiency, inabilities, and spends the next 7 weeks without moving very far away. He said, well, who shall I teach? Oh, those 5 disciples with whom I spent 6 years. Their Dharma eye is only slightly covered with the dust of ignorance. So he travels, knowing where they are, to the Deer Park near Sarnath, and he begins to teach them on the very first discourse on the Four Noble Truths. And this is the beginning of this deed, which was essentially the next long period of the Buddha's life. So many decades teaching, and for the rest of his life at that time, after that time, spent many decades teaching, turning the wheel of Dharma, finally took the aspect of passing away, dying, passing into parinirvana. So that, in a nutshell, just as it's sort of an introduction, is a little bit about the life of the Buddha, the 12 deeds.
This is something you hear again and again, Lam Rim, graduated path. Lam means path, and Rim means graduated or graded, yeah, step by step. And this way of practicing is very specific, to the Tibetan Buddhist presentation of the path. If we think a little bit about the history of Buddhism, because the Lam Rim contains all the Buddha's teachings on sutra. The sutra path. There's two paths, the sutra and the tantra. And the Buddha's path on sutra is divided up, in the Hinayana attitude and the Mahayana attitude. And the Hinayana and Mahayana path, they are all included in the Lam Rim. The main difference between Hinayana and Mahayana is mainly in the attitude, the purpose and the goal. Yeah? That in the Hinayana one motivates oneself for one's own liberation. In the Mahayana attitude, the attitude is seeking enlightenment, for the sake of all living beings, a more universal goal. And for that we train ourselves in renunciation, bodhicitta, and the correct view. Of course, actually to attain enlightenment,